Today, Isaac Shapiro is an attorney with Skadden Arps. He lives here in Manhattan on Park Avenue and still works with Skadden Arps in an of-counsel role. There's just about nothing about Isaac's life today that would prepare you for the story of his childhood. When Isaac would tell people that he was born a Jewish refugee in Japan in 1931 and grew up there as a stateless foreigner during World War II, surviving deadly bombings of Tokyo with his family, they were surprised. When he'd share how he'd been discovered by the victorious US military on the streets of Japan in 1945 and recruited to work with them at age 14 as an interpreter and guide, including inspecting the devastation of Hiroshima and witnessing the signing of peace treaties, they were shocked. When he'd continue discussing how he had been sponsored to come to America at age 15 by a US Marine colonel from Arkansas and his wife, became a US citizen, fought in the Korean War, and attended Columbia, they'd say, "Ike, you've got to write a book." So he did, and the first self-published version of Edokko was released nearly 10 years ago. Isaac did some speaking engagements, and the book did well. But afterward, he was assumed he was done with Edokko until a few years ago when a woman who works with the publishing company seasidepress.org picked up a copy at a friend's house. She loved the book, contacted Isaac, and asked if he'd consider updating the story and allowing her to republish it. The book came out last fall, and tonight Ike is going to share some of his favorite sequences from the book. And then we hope that you'll stay with us for a Q&A session. He'd love to share more about his story with you. Isaac's first reading tonight takes place not in Japan, but in the Russian Jewish community of Harbin, China, where his parents lived before moving to Japan, and where his mother returned with young Isaac and his brothers when she separated from his father in the early 1930s. Harbin in Manchuria was at this point under occupation by the Japanese military. It was an unsafe and lawless time. Isaac.
As a toddler, I was blissfully unaware of the physical danger of living in Harbin under the Japanese occupation. I had no idea that my mother's life had been directly threatened in the summer of 1933. The incident became known as the most internationally sensational kidnapping case among the many that were occurring in Manchuria on a regular basis in those years. The case involved a young 24-year-old pianist named Simeon Kaspe, whose father, Joseph Kaspe, was a wealthy jewelry store owner and a prominent member of Harbin's Russian Jewish community. He had come to Harbin after the Russo-Japanese War, during which he had fought in the Russian cavalry. By 1933, the elder Kaspe was not only a successful jeweler, but was also the sole owner of the Hotel Modern, a luxurious establishment in downtown Harbin. Today, the Modern is once again a luxury hotel, having been restored to its original condition and decorated with memorabilia from the early 20th century when it was built. I was there and saw it in 2006. It was absolutely staggering. The case involved a young, Kaspe was also the head of a theatrical company which operated a chain of stage theaters and cinemas. And he had sent his two sons to study in France, where they became French citizens. Kaspe was also the head of a young Simeon had returned to Harbin after graduating from the Paris Conservatory of Music. He was among the many young men in Harbin then courting my mother, a beautiful 28-year-old woman, despite the fact that she had 4 sons. They found her attractive nevertheless. Late on the night of August 24th, 1933, Simeon Kaspe and my mother were kidnapped, just as Kaspe was driving her home after an evening out. Years later, it was revealed that the kidnapping, in fact, all of the frequent kidnappings in Harbin, were the work of Russian bandits hired by the local Japanese police, acting strictly out of financial greed. Kaspe was able to persuade his captors to drop my mother off at our house before they absconded with him. How shaken she was from the experience, I can only imagine, because during the rest of her life, she refused to discuss any of it with us.
Simeon Kasp would ultimately be sadly murdered by his kidnappers. And while Isaac's mother never shared details of their relationship after her death in 1983, the family discovered a well-preserved letter that he had sent to her while in captivity. A few years after this horrific incident, Isaac's mother returned with the children to Japan and reunited with Isaac's father. And I just want to give you a quick explanation of how this Russian Jewish family came to be in China and Japan in the first place. Isaac's parents each fled Russia in the early 1920s. His father as a result of the revolution, his mother as a result of the deadly pogroms that were taking place there. They met in Berlin, where they were both classical musicians looking for work. And from Berlin, where Hitler had not yet begun his rise, but it was also quite an unsettled time in Germany and not the best environment for them to raise a family. They moved to Paris, then to Palestine, then to Harbin, China, then to Japan, as you've heard, then back to Harbin, China. And now, as war became World War, and Japan allied with Nazi Germany, life was changing for the Shapiros, now reunited in Japan. Isaac?
With the outbreak of the war came the classification of foreigners living in Japan into categories. Allies like the Germans and the Italians, enemy aliens like the Americans, the British, the Dutch, and Australians, neutrals like the Soviets, the Swiss, and the Swedish, and finally, foreigners like us who had no nationality. We were called mukokuseki, literally without nationality. Those were the words we had to use when filling out forms in which we had to indicate our citizenship. Stateless people did not all fall into one simple category. We were known as the white or Tsarist Russians. While this term had no legal significance whatsoever, it indicated our national origin and also distinguished us from the Soviets or Red Russians, most of them diplomats, who resided in Japan. We were, however, never referred to by the Japanese authorities as Jews. That was one distinction the Japanese did not make. The only whiff of anti-Semitism during the war came with the publication in Japanese of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a well-known literary forgery. It had first been published in Russian in 1903 and alleged a Jewish and Masonic plot to achieve world domination. I noticed its presence in a neighboring bookstore. To my great surprise, right next to it was a stack of protocols. Right next to the stack of protocols was a stack of books called History of the Jewish People, a straightforward historical account by a Japanese biblical scholar. I stopped by the bookstore several times and was surprised and delighted to see that the history book was rapidly selling out, while the protocols didn't seem to be selling at all. In any event, whether it was because we were stateless, because my parents were musicians and teachers of modest means, or because my parents had 5 sons, the Japanese treated us kindly and with a show of great respect throughout the war. The Soviet Union did not declare war on Japan until August 9th, 1945, only 6 days before Japan surrendered. During that short interval, the Japanese authorities scarcely had time to consider how to deal with stateless Russians like ourselves.
Like many around the world during World War II, the Shapiros experienced disturbing and frightening events. Isaac shares many memories of the war's impact in Japan in Edokko, including this recollection of sabotage at Yokohama Harbor. Isaac.
On our side of the world in mid-November, the Battle of Guadalcanal was underway between the Japanese and American forces in the South Pacific. Closer to home in Yokohama Harbor, a major incident of sabotage occurred that shook us all up and brought the war to our immediate attention. On November 30th, between 1:30 and 2 p.m., while we were in school, we heard a terrific explosion. Another, twice as strong, immediately followed it. Everyone, student and teacher alike, rushed up to the roof of our school building. We saw a gigantic fire near the docks below, the flames and billows of smoke getting larger and larger. 3 German ships docked at Yokohama Harbor had exploded, and several buildings in the harbor's edge were on fire. As soon as we were dismissed from school at 3 p.m., we saw German sailors arriving on shore. Some of them were blind, others had no legs. Most of them, although seriously injured, could walk with help. By 4 p.m., the fires had begun to die out. The air was thick with smoke and ashes and smelled of sulfur. Somebody said the smell came from the exploded buildings, which were ammunition warehouses. Police were positioned all over the bluff, not letting anyone go down to the harbor. That night, as we lay in bed, my brother Joseph said he had heard rumors that the explosion had been the result of sabotage. A French ship had steamed out the day before.
As the war drew to a close, the U.S. drew closer to Japan. The Shapiros were moved by the Japanese government from Yokohama to Tokyo, where the family experienced deadly bombing raids.
The year 1945 began with the familiar sound of air raid sirens, which woke me up shortly after midnight. I turned on the radio to hear an announcement that one enemy plane had been seen flying toward Tokyo. From my bed, I saw the anti-aircraft guns flashing. My 14th birthday, January 5th, fell on a Friday, and I woke up to the sound of bombs falling all around us. By the time I was dressed, I could see flames in the distance. Looking up, I saw Japanese fighters flying up to meet the B-29 Super Fortresses. I saw one of them go down in a blaze of fire, even as anti-aircraft guns were blazing. Suddenly I heard a loud noise and saw a large metal object drop into the compound in front of our house. It turned out to be a shell from a 12-millimeter American cannon. A short time later, 2 air raid wardens arrived and demanded that we turn the shell over to them. After a short argument, we handed it to one of the officials. By the end of January, following a series of intensive raids, trams and subways were no longer running, and we stopped going to school altogether.
In August of 1945, the U.S. bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and soon after, the emperor made an historic address to the Japanese nation. The war was over. A few days later, 14-year-old Isaac made a decision that would change his life. He went to Yokohama Harbor to watch the arrival of the victorious U.S. military. And an important note here is that when Isaac was in school in Japan, he studied English, so he was fluent in the language.
I watched the Americans come ashore, hundreds of them crammed into motorboats, speeding from their ships to the docks. Nothing about that moment was familiar or ordinary. It was unreal, and I could feel the excitement. I watched one motorized boat zoom toward the dock, and soon I could make out the GI's faces. A few of the American soldiers seemed to be staring right at me. I stared back at them. Suddenly I was startled by a voice much closer and quite loud. "Hi there!" I turned quickly. A tall U.S. Army officer in his late 20s had joined me on the embankment. "I'm Captain Kelly," he said, with a broad smile. No relative of yours. And held out his hand. I took it and waited for him to continue. "Do you speak Japanese?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "Good. Then you can help me. I've commandeered a school bus, but I can't communicate with the driver. Come with me and tell him where to go."
Isaac worked with the U.S. military for more than a year, and then the following year, in 1946, a U.S. Marine colonel named Toby Munn and his wife asked Isaac's parents for permission to bring the boy to America. Understanding the opportunity that this would provide to their son, they said yes. Isaac would go on to become a U.S. citizen, fight in the Korean War, attend Columbia University, and pursue his successful career in international law. His parents and several of his brothers later joined him in America, where they too found success. There's a lot more in Isaac's memoir, Edokko, Growing Up a Stateless Foreigner in Wartime Japan, and we hope that you'll enjoy reading it. In the meantime, Isaac would love to discuss the story with you. Does anyone have a question? We have a microphone here for you.
Isaac, did you keep a diary at the time, or did your brother help you? How can you remember all this?
I did keep a diary during the war, and I shared it with my brother. I think I sold it to him, actually. And then after the war, I took it back from him. It stopped short of the end of the war, but what it reveals with hindsight and interest is that we were secretly very sympathetic with the Allies, and we wrote in our diaries with disregard for the consequences that we hoped that the Allies would win the war. And it's the one piece of evidence I had as to which side we were on. Ah, my granddaughter.
Hello. Hi. How long did it take you to write it? The book?
Oh gosh, about 2 years.
Okay. Does anyone?
I have a question. So with all the members of the family, were you the only one that secretly hoped that the Allies would win the war? Were there family members that wanted the Japanese to win?
No, actually, my two oldest brothers left Tokyo in 1944 and went to Harbin to live with my grandfather because we had too many mouths to feed. And they had just graduated from high school. So in 1944, there were 17 twins, and they moved to Harbin. As far as others in the family, my brother, whom I shared my diary with, also expressed the same sympathies for the Allies that I did.
And why? I mean, you were born and brought up in Japan. Well, how come you sided with the Allies?
It's very simple. We were strongly anti-German because of the persecution of the Jews. We knew about that, and so we certainly had no sympathy for the Germans and didn't want them to win. And if the Japanese had won, it would have meant that the Germans had won too.
Were you aware of a larger Jewish community in Japan? Because I know there's some. My great uncle was briefly in Japan during the war and had an address in a Jewish community in Kobe, and So were there any other Jews around when you were growing up?
Yes, the largest Jewish community in Japan was in Kobe. Kobe was a major port and the major port for ships coming from Europe.
Yeah. But what about where you were living?
No, we were, Kobe was a good distance from Tokyo.
Yeah.
And I don't remember being in Kobe until after the war.
Mm-hmm.
What is your native language?
I grew up speaking
Your native
Russian.
language?
I grew up speaking Russian for the first 5 years of my life. Even though we lived in China, in Harbin, I learned no Chinese, to my regret. And when I moved back to Japan in the summer of 1936, I was enrolled in a British school and started to learn English for the first time. I knew no English. My mother came to school with me every day to interpret for me until one day I said to her, I don't want you with me anymore. I can follow.
When were you aware of the special issue the Jews had for Second World War,
Was I aware of what?
of the Holocaust?
Yes,
When?
we became aware of it primarily through the stories of refugees coming from Germany to Japan, from Europe generally. And there was a stream of them. You may have heard of Sugihara, the consul in Lithuania. Yes, and Sugihara gave hundreds of visas. He's honored in a cemetery in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem as the sort of honorary Jew. And my father, who spoke English, served as an interpreter for many, many refugees that came and couldn't communicate at the American consulate because they didn't know any English. And my father would go with them to the consulate, help them apply for visas, and literally hundreds of refugees until after Pearl Harbor came through Japan, thanks to Sugihara, and my father served them well as their interpreter till they got visas and moved on to America.
Isaac, can I apologize, but we had one more reading that I skipped over.
Yes.
And it's a very interesting part of Isaac's story. While working with the U.S. military, Isaac witnessed the signing of the peace treaty between the U.S. and Japan. And in October of 1945, he was asked to accompany U.S. military leaders on a trip to witness the damage that had been done when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It was a day that he's never forgotten. And he'd like to
Yes,
mention
I'll
that
read
too.
from the book. On Sunday, October 28, 1945, a group of senior naval officers, several nurses from the Benevolence, a U.S. hospital ship, and I flew from Yokosuka to Hiroshima to survey the damaged city. For reasons I can't remember, my sponsor, Colonel Munn, didn't join us. There were altogether 15 of us. We flew on a transport known as an R-5C, a slow twin-engine, silver-colored propeller plane. There's a picture in the book of the group of us. They were all together, we left Yokosuka at 8:35 in the morning and landed in Hiroshima 2 hours and 50 minutes later. It was a cool day, but I had been issued a leather flight jacket with a fur collar a few days earlier. I also had been issued a full-length leather coat, and it was more than adequate to keep me warm. We were already aware that an atomic bomb had been detonated over Hiroshima on the morning of August 6th. That's a few days from now. At a height of 1,850 feet, and that of the estimated 400,000 people present in the city that morning, more than 75,000 had been instantly killed, and that almost the entire central core of the city had been pulverized. But none of us was prepared for the sight that greeted us after we stepped off the plane at the Hiroshima airfield. What had once been a thriving city was literally a wasteland, a sea of rubble. Looking clear across the city from one end to the other, we saw only 2 burned-out buildings left standing, including at the epicenter of the blast, the famous dome building that has become a monument and a world-renowned symbol of the world's first nuclear airstrike. For 2 hours we were speechless, walking from one pile of rubble to another. I had been accustomed to seeing glass fragments after conventional air raids, but I couldn't find a single cracked or broken piece in this rubble. Picking up a glob of glass that had melted into an unrecognizable mass, I realized that the intense heat generated by the bomb had turned all glass objects into molten globs. Toward the city center, I saw a lone streetcar making its way across town on the horizon. I saw a few pedestrians hundreds of yards away, walking aimlessly through what must have been streets, but which now led nowhere. Most of them walked alone, and there were no children to be seen, as if people felt there was still danger in the air, and children shouldn't be allowed outside. It was a macabre scene which I have never forgotten. When we finally left, we flew back to Yokosuka in total silence, struck dumb by our day's experience.
Thank you.
Any other questions on behalf? Yes.
And I always got the feeling, especially in China and also in Japan, that they really didn't understand who Jews were. So I never felt anti-Semitism in either country. But I'm sure I don't really how did you feel about that?
Well, first of all, there was a large Jewish community in China, much larger than Japan. Harbin, which at the turn of the 19th century was a small town, became populated as a result of the pogroms of the latter part of the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century. And a synagogue was built there, which is still there. It's a museum. I've been there. I was there in 2006. And there is a Harbin Center for Jews, of which I'm an honorary member. And they maintain the history, and they maintain, excuse me, the cemetery, which has been moved outside the city, where my grandparents are both buried. And very large number of Jews met there. And in Japan, the Jews were much fewer in number. They started coming at the end of the 19th century. But you're absolutely right. There was no serious discrimination of any kind. If anything, the feeling of anti-Semitism, to the extent it existed, came from other foreigners who brought it with them from Europe.
Can you talk about the Japanese culture? Do you remember, were the women wearing kimonos, and were there not many cars back then? And
Yes,
was
well,
it very rural?
we were very much embedded in Japanese culture because we lived, for the most part, in communities which were Japanese and not foreign. There were foreign enclaves in Yokohama on the bluff, Yamate, series of Western-style houses. All of the business executives who were assigned to Yokohama lived up there. It was where the schools were, the foreign schools, Yokohama International School, St. Joseph's College, St. Moore's, the girls' school. And the more privileged foreigners lived up there. We lived on the coast, near the beach, and there were only half a dozen or so foreigners who lived in that area. Yes.
Okay, so here you are Jewish. There are foreigners, I assume, from Germany as well. How would you interact with the Germans that were with Nazi sympathies?
Well, that was very curious because the German government controlled their population. They were all subject to oversight by the Germans. Germans had a Gestapo unit to watch out for them, and we got to know some of them. And interestingly enough, my best friend, when I was 10 years old, was a young German who had been stuck in Japan after his family had started to go back to Germany from New York, where his father was a banker with the Commerzbank, and they were stuck in Japan because they couldn't continue on the Trans-Siberian Railway after the Soviets declared war on Germany. And so they spent the war years in Japan instead of going back to Germany. And my friend, who sat in front of me in school at St. Joseph's and became my close friend, came once a week in his Hitlerjugend uniform and ostensibly was watched over by the Gestapo and so on. But his parents allowed him to be friendly with a Jewish boy. And my parents accepted him because he showed no signs of anti-Semitism, and they met his parents, who were of Catholic religion from the Munich area, and were quite openly anti-Nazi. Yeah, at their own peril. And the sister of my friend has written a book called Journey Interrupted. You can find it on Amazon. Journey Interrupted, which is a story of the Erklentz family having moved from New York to Japan and been stuck there during the war. They were then interned after the war by the Americans when they went back to Germany, and eventually they found their way back to New York, and we resumed our friendship, and my friend died 4 years ago. Yeah. Still friendly with his sister.
Can you tell us about meeting Emperor Hirohito?
Well, he was a controversial character. There was an attempt at a military coup before the war to dislodge him. He was the titular head, but General Tojo ruled Japan during the war. And then after the war, thanks to General MacArthur's policies, he was allowed to remain on the throne. MacArthur considered it an asset to have him there, while the military trials of General Tojo and the other military leaders went on. And there's a very famous picture of him standing next to General MacArthur at the U.S. Embassy, this very short Japanese emperor, and MacArthur towering over him. He remained until his death, and I had the honor of entertaining him in New York when I was president of the Japan Society, and he came on an official visit. And later on, he invited my wife and myself to a dinner party at the Imperial Palace. And he remained literally free of any kind of persecution or intimidation until his death. And his son, Akihito, is about to abdicate next year in favor of his son. One of the first abdications in centuries. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Considering that there must have been a lot of, what's the right word, censorship by the Japanese government of what was actually going on in the war, how aware were you of what was going on in the war, and when do you remember knowing the Japanese were losing?
you're quite right to point that out. There was very, very tough censorship during the war. We never had a radio or a telephone for that matter. And so what we learned from our neighbors, many of whom did have radios and listened to foreign broadcasts. The newspapers were all censored, and the Japanese defeats as the Allies conquered more and more territory in the Pacific were minimized or completely excluded from newspaper accounts. But through the grapevine, we learned an awful lot, and we're quite well aware of Japan's progressive defeats until the final stage, and especially after the beginning of the air raids, when it was clear that the Americans had conquered Mariana Islands, the Japanese had lost the Battle of Midway. The war was progressing. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, it was just impossible to ignore the fact that the Japanese were slowly being defeated. And particularly with the intensity of the air raids, there just wasn't any question about it. And we were evacuated from the coast where we lived in Yokohama until '44. And then the Japanese government evacuated all foreigners living on the coastline because they were anticipating an invasion. And so we were moved to Tokyo, courtesy of the Japanese government, which found us a house and paid for our move. And we're quite decent about it.
Was that frightening?
It was very frightening because with the intensity of the air raids in the fall of '44 and the spring of '45, it became uncertain whether we could survive and what would happen to Japan.
Excuse me. I just wanted to know if you had any concept or idea about why did the Japanese become allies with the Germans politically?
Why did they become?
Yes, allies. I've never quite understood that.
Well, it's a long and complicated story. Partly it's the Japanese feeling of inferiority after World War I, when they were allied with the British and the Americans, and felt that they weren't given equal treatment at the conferences and the peace talks and so forth. And partly it was the military ascendance in Japan itself, and the sympathy that the military had for the Germans. Germany was winning battles in Europe and then invaded the Soviet Union in summer of '41. So they were looked up to.
Whatever happened to your mom and dad? Did they come to America and then were they able to get jobs as classical musicians?
Yes. My parents remained in Japan till 1952. After the peace treaty was signed, my mother had a relative in California who was a musician, and my parents were both musicians and wanted to come to America and continue their careers. My mother was only in her 40s, and she no longer had the responsibility for 5 children. The only one of her sons who remained at home was my younger brother, who was 6 years old when the war ended, and he eventually emigrated with them to California in 1952. And California in the 50s, 60s had a coterie of Western musicians, very famous, Arthur Rubinstein, Yasha Heifetz, Pitigorsky, a whole slew of refugee musicians who worked in Hollywood and Los Angeles, and I believe Stokowski was the conductor of the Los Angeles Symphony. And so they found a community with which they had affinity and which welcomed them. And so they pursued their musical careers in Los Angeles until they both died.
What instruments did they play, your parents?
I can't hear you.
What instruments did they play? And did you play
My
music?
father was a cellist,
Wow.
also composer and a conductor, and my mother was a pianist.
What did you find solace in as a child? You were severely traumatized. Do you find that the beach scares you? Do you find solace in music? Did they maintain faith through this? I mean, I was in China in '83 as a student, and I'm 63 years old, and history has to be told. And Herodotus has said that, you know, there's no such thing as objectivity. What you're doing is crucial. What did you find solace in such a horrible thing? Music?
What did I find horrible?
No, solace. Solace. What solace? What faith?
Where did you find solace?
Your parents.
Where did you find
Solace.
Oh,
solace,
solace.
having gone through so much?
Oh, goodness. Friends. Good friendships with other children, of whom there were many, foreigners like ourselves, living in our neighborhood, in school with us. And we spent our time, when we weren't in school, with each other, not so much with our parents. Our parents lived their own separate lives, and there was a much greater distance between parents and children in those days, as you can attest to yourself. Yes, darling.
Can you tell people a little about sneaking out to the movies and things, how Hollywood and the movies were such a big thing for you? Because
yes,
a lot of your childhood involved that kind of a thing.
My father was very strict, and we were forbidden from going to movies, and so we had to do that secretly. The one and only time that I remember being allowed to go to the movies was on my 10th birthday in January of '41. I was allowed to go and see The Seahawk with Errol Flynn.
Do we have any more questions?
Well, just what a fascinating
Thank you.
history, and didn't take place that long ago, too. So,
70
yeah, 70 years.
plus
now.
years.
Thank you, Chris Kelly. Thank you, Isaac Shapiro.
Thank you all.
And I know you'll stick around and sign copies for us.